Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 1225 of the Juicebox Podcast. Today on Defining Diabetes, Jenny Smith and I are going to define duration of insulin action. Nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan. When you place your first order for AG1 with my link, you'll get 5 free travel packs and a free year supply of vitamin D. drinkag1.com/juicebox. If you have type 1 diabetes or are the caregiver of someone with type 1 and a U.S. resident, please go to t1dexchange.org/juicebox and complete the survey. Your answers will help to move type 1 diabetes research forward, and it may help you too. t1dexchange.org/juicebox. If you're living with diabetes or are the caregiver of someone who is, and you're looking for an online community of supportive people who understand, check out the Juicebox Podcast private Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast Type 1 Diabetes. There are now 50,000 members who are sharing stories and ideas. Go check out this amazing private and free Facebook group. Today's episode is sponsored by Medtronic Diabetes, a company that's bringing together people who are redefining what it means to live with diabetes. Later in this episode, I'll be speaking with Mark. He was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at 28. He's 47 now. Then at the very end of the episode, you can hear my entire mini interview with Mark. To hear more stories from the Medtronic Champion community or to share your own story, visit medtronicdiabetes.com/juicebox and check out the Medtronic Champion hashtag on social media. Jenny, let's define duration of insulin action. That's DIA. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. People want to know how to figure it out. Depending on different insulin types, impacts on boluses, manual pumps versus algorithms, etc., and so on. So first of all, duration of insulin action. Is it something that it's not quantifiable specifically to the insulin? It's got to do with you as well, right?
Yes. Because in terms of, as you said, quantifiable to the insulin, anybody who opens up those little paper packets inside of your insulin, which nobody does, that all goes in the garbage, right? Mm-hmm. You'll actually see what the manufacturer has in terms of the duration of insulin action, its profile. It's sort of a bell curve of action, right? And that's tested and true, but that's coming out of a lab. That's not in the individual body. And as everybody in the diabetes community knows, your diabetes may vary. And that includes how long insulin may act in your body. We're talking about rapid insulin here, right?
Yep.
So.
Okay. So it's not as easy just to say, I pulled out the package insert for Fiasp and it says it peaks here and it dissipates here and blah, blah, blah. And that's going to work the same for everyone. That's not the case.
It's a guidepost. It's a guide, right? It's a starting place.
So I don't want to freak everybody out, but could the duration of insulin action for you change from day to day? Week to week? Not necessarily?
Not necessarily. I wouldn't say that. I would say person to person is much more the case that it could be a little bit longer here or a little bit shorter there. I think scenario also changes things. Again, working with a lot of women in pregnancy, we find that not only is insulin need increased as pregnancy progresses, especially into the 3rd trimester, but also that the clearance of insulin is faster in pregnancy. So it goes in a bit slower in action to begin with from a resistance factor, but the end effect kind of has almost a clearing effect a bit faster.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of that has to do with, right, we're taking insulin by injection or by a pump, and whatever in that, there are sort of pieces of that get moved out by the kidneys and they get kind of flushed by the body, right? So there are parts in that end of action time that could change, but it again is based on scenario or where you are, not on day to day. Today it works for 3 hours. Tomorrow, I don't know, it looked like it worked for 5 hours.
So if you're having that experience, very likely you've not used enough insulin or timed it well or something to that effect.
Correct.
Okay. But is it this specific case of pregnancy, or like, are there other spots that can like chew it up? And
there are other spots, those who have any sort of degrees of kidney disease.
Okay.
That can also change insulin action time.
All right.
So those are some of the very specifics that could change in one person. But again, it's not a night and day change, or it's not an hour to hour kind of, oh, it's here now. Tonight I have to consider it's 3 hours instead of 5 hours.
Gotcha. For most people, once they see it, I injected it here, I pushed the button here, it started to work. 20 minutes later, it really started to pick up steam. 30 minutes in, 45 minutes, it felt like it was at its full power. Hour and a half later, I felt like it was trailing off. Whatever those numbers are, once you start seeing it, you should see it with some consistency.
You should.
Okay.
And that's, again, there are always some variables in the picture. One, has your basal insulin been evaluated?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if it has, then wherever a bolus of rapid acting insulin leaves you, your basal should hold you nice and stable in that time period after you expect that rapid has stopped working, right? But if your basal hasn't been tested, then you can't really test the duration of insulin action for your rapid dose, because the basal might be pulling or not giving enough strength in that latent part, if that makes sense.
You have to hold this in two different places in your mind.
Yeah.
The insulin action works as it works, but the result you see could be different if your basal's not correct and other factors.
Yeah. The other one would be fat, right?
Okay.
A high fat intake or a high protein type of meal. Those are not the meals. If you're going into understanding this term, so to speak, you're really not going to test this out in a scenario where you sit down to, a 12-ounce steak with butter all over your potato.
Yeah. A baked potato, right? Jenny, with some sea salt on it, maybe, and some cracked pepper.
Are you hungry?
I mean, now that you're talking like this.
Sorry.
Jeez, no. And so that's important because,
yes.
All right, let's talk about it specifically. Like, I once heard somebody who really, really understood loop as an example, who told me insulin action is 6 hours in loop. Right? We're sure. We see it so many times, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, and then somebody else would come along and go, I have my insulin action set to 4 hours in loop. But that's all just about like wanting the algorithm to be more aggressive. There you're kind of falsely manipulating the insulin action to talk the algorithm into believing that the insulin's gone. Is that right?
Correct. And that is ages old. Even years ago, with no algorithm types of pumps, people realized that what the pump was calculating as IOB, or insulin on board, which is another term that kind of goes along with this duration of insulin action.
Right.
So people would say, well, by 2 hours after a meal, I'm still high. Why is the pump not suggesting anything? Well, if your duration of insulin action is set for 4 hours, the pump thinks that at noon, you're 4 units. 2 hours later, there's still 2 units left.
Right.
You've got 2 hours before the rest of that finishes. It's not going to offer you anything. So those who were smart were thinking, well, I can fiddle with this system. I can set my duration of insulin action at 2 hours, because then at 2 hours, if I'm high, now the pump will give me more insulin. And ooh, this definitely is what I want to do. But all you're really doing is you're tinkering. Like, you're tinkering.
You're talking the bolus calculator into believing there's no insulin there so that it will suggest more insulin based on the blood sugar.
Yes.
During my most aggressive times, just using a manual Omnipod with Arden, I think I had her insulin action set at 3 hours at one point, because no matter what, I wanted the bolus calculator considering the carbs that were there, because I knew our settings were good and that it wouldn't be stacking if I did that.
Yeah.
I hope people understand what we're saying here is that insulin on board in your pump is really just a calculation made based on what you tell the pump your insulin action time is. Now, some of the algorithms, I would imagine you can't manipulate that in Omnipod 5, for example. It believes what it believes.
Yeah. Omnipod 5 is interesting. Tandem's Control IQ It's a hard set 5 hours with the algorithm enabled.
Okay.
Omnipod 5 has an allowance for duration of insulin action to be adjustable by the user, but it's only going to reflect boluses that the user drives. So if I take via Omnipod 5's suggestion 2 units right now for the food that I'm going to eat, that has with a calculation, let's say I have my duration of insulin action set in the system at 2.5 hours. So at noon today, 2 units, 2.5 hours later by 2:30, I should technically have no IOB left from this driven bolus.
Okay.
However, as we know, algorithms have their own output. So at 2:30 in the afternoon, maybe I was higher and the system accommodated and gave me a little extra nudge of insulin. There might at 2:30 still be IOB coming from what the system is driving out, but no longer from that noon bolus. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
They are manipulatable in some of the pumps.
And so if you don't want to get into all of this and you just want to understand duration of insulin action, are they different from like, is Novolog and Apidra, are they different? Or do you don't think about that? You just think of faster acting as faster acting, right?
Right. Rapid acting, the Novolog, the Apidra, and the Humalog, those 3, which are all classified just normal rapid actings, they do have a similar enough profile of starts here, peaks here, finish action by about, they say 3 to 5 hours, which is, 2 hours is a good difference in time, right? But by about 5 hours later, the expectation is that those are cleared from the system.
Okay.
The more rapid acting insulins, like Fiasp and the Lumjev, those tend to have not only a faster onset, but because so they end up having, when I used Fiasp, I loved it. It had a really nice, flat, complete, very visible finish. There wasn't this little trickle action kind of nearing to the end. When it was done, it was done. It was very easy to see. In terms of Apidra, I know their initial, when they came to market, their big thing was that you could really, it seemed to be almost like they were saying it was a much more rapid insulin because you could take it either at the start of the meal or 20 minutes into the meal and you'd have the same blood sugar management. Now, I tried that.
Arden uses it. I don't find that to be true.
That does not work.
Yeah. I mean, in fairness, if you mean and not go over 200, it does that pretty well, Sure. Right. The way I've always described Apidra is that it's very consistent and stable throughout the bolus. I don't see any like crazy hot moments where it's burning like extra, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, wow, it's really working right now. Like it starts to work and it continues to work like that. And I don't have any trouble bolusing then for the next thing and seeing some crazy like hot flash where it makes you super low out of nowhere. It's very consistent and stable for Arden.
Yeah, I was going to say, and it was the complete opposite. When it came to market, I really wanted to try it. It was not that way for me at all.
Not funny.
It seemed to work well initially, but if I used it I was using a lot of extended boluses, it did not work well in extended boluses for me at all.
That's interesting.
It was like the extended portion that was getting dripped in had not the right amount of action.
I gotcha.
Compared to my long-term used Humalog. So again, person to person.
But okay. But we understand what duration of insulin action is. Did we miss anything
hopefully
there?
This was well defined.
I mean, I feel like we talked way more about it than most people do.
Well, one thing people are probably considering it. We talked about some of the variables where you wouldn't really want to expect to need to change it, right? But one way to test it out, if you're kind of curious, because our rapid insulin is really meant to cover what macronutrient? Carbohydrates.
Carbs, that's it, yeah.
So if you really wanted to test and see with a known nice basal setting, you could certainly just eat, way out, get a 15-gram portion or a 10-gram portion of carbohydrate, take whatever the dose is supposed to be for that, expect by about 90 minutes, you're probably going to be peaking. Insulin action should have kind of a bell curve. Your blood sugar goes up, you peak at a certain place, might plateau for about 30 minutes, and then it should curve back down to get you close to where you started before you ate whatever it was. That's a good way to kind of see where does it finish and does it stay stable then?
Right. Okay. Very nice. Thank you.
So, yes.
Excellent. A diabetes diagnosis comes with a lot of new terms, and you're not going to understand most of them. That's why we made Defining Diabetes. Go to juiceboxpodcast.com, up into the menu, and click on Defining Diabetes to find the series that will tell you what all of those words mean. Short, fun, and informative, that's Defining Diabetes. The Diabetes Variables series from the Juicebox Podcast goes over all the little things that affect your diabetes that you might not think about. From travel and exercise to hydration and even trampolines. Juiceboxpodcast.com. Go up in the menu and click on Diabetes Variables. And now my full conversation with Medtronic champion, Mark. Mark, how old were you when you were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes?
I was 28.
28. How old are you now?
47.
47. So just about 20 years?
Yeah, 19 years.
What was your management style when you were diagnosed?
I used injections for about 6 months, and then my endocrinologist in the Navy recommended a pump.
How long had you been in the Navy?
Let's see, 8 years up to that point.
8 years.
Yeah.
I've interviewed a number of people who have been diagnosed during service, and most of the time they're discharged. What happened to you?
I was medically discharged. Yeah, 6 months after my diagnosis.
I don't understand the whole system. Is that like honorable?
Yeah. I mean, essentially, if you get a medical discharge, you get a commensurate honorable discharge. I guess there could be cases where something other than that, but that's really how it happens. So it's an honorable discharge but because of medical reasons.
And that still gives you access to the VA for the rest of your life, right?
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
Do you use the VA for your management?
I used to up until a few years ago when we moved to North Carolina. It just became untenable.
Mm-hmm.
Just the rigmarole and process to kind of get all the things I needed, for diabetes management. It was far easier just to go through a private practice.
Was it your goal to stay in the Navy for your whole life, your career?
It was. Yeah. In fact, I think a few months before my diagnosis, my wife and I had that discussion about, staying in for the long term. And, we'd made the decision despite all the hardships and time away from home. That was what we loved the most. So that's what made it that much more difficult.
Was the Navy a lifetime goal of yours or something you came to as an adult?
Lifetime goal. I mean, as my earliest childhood memories were flying, being a fighter pilot, and specifically being flying on and off aircraft carriers. So, watching Top Gun in the 80s certainly was a catalyst for that.
You've taken off and landed a jet on an aircraft carrier?
Hundreds of times.
Is there anything in life as exhilarating as that?
No, but there's a roller coaster I rode at, I think it's Cedar Rapids up in Cleveland, Sandusky. And they've got this roller coaster that takes you from 0 to, I think it's like 80 or something. You go up a big hill and you come right back down. So the acceleration is pretty similar, I would say, to a catapult shot.
I'm going to guess you own a Tesla.
I don't.
Oh, okay.
I'm a boring guy. I got a hybrid RAV4. I get made fun of. I get called, my wife says I drive like a grandpa. I'm a 5 miles per hour over the speed limit person. No more than that. So yeah, in the car, I'm boring, Scott.
So you've never felt a need to try to replace that with something else?
You can't replace it. It's irreplaceable.
That's what I thought.
So up until the point where someone, buys me an F-18 or allows me to get inside a 2-seater and fly it, you can't replace it.
How did it make you feel when you saw, or maybe you haven't seen, a gentleman named Pietro has his large aircraft license. He's flying for a major carrier now. He has type 1 diabetes. Does that feel hopeful to you?
Yeah, it does. When I was diagnosed, that wasn't a possibility. The FAA prohibited commercial pilots who had type 1 diabetes. But I think it was 2017 when they changed their rules to allow type 1 diabetics to be commercial pilots. And part of the reason they did that was because of the technology advancements, specifically in pump therapy and pump management. So I don't have any aspirations of going to the commercial airlines, but one of my sons who has type 1 diabetes very much wants to be a commercial pilot. So, in that respect, I'm very hopeful and thankful.
Yeah. Do you fly privately now for pleasure?
I do. Yeah. One of my favorite things to do is fly my kids to the different soccer tournaments they have all over the Southeast U.S. So last week, my wife and I and 2 of our boys flew up to Richmond for their soccer tournaments up there. And Charlie, who's my middle child, has type 1 diabetes. So, if I can combine flying, family, and football in one weekend, to me, I think I've just achieved Valhalla.
So then it sounds to me like this diagnosis was a significant course correction for you. Can you tell me how it affected your dream?
Well, I guess 3 words come to mind. First, it was devastating. everything I had done in life, everything I'd worked up to that point was just taken away in an instant. And I was not prepared for that at all. The second emotion was, it was scary. I hadn't thought much about life outside the Navy, certainly not life as anything else but a fighter pilot. And Heather and I were getting ready to move to France. I was going to do an exchange tour with the French Naval Air Force. So we were taking French classes. So pretty quickly, I had to reinvent myself. And then probably the most important thing, at the same time that all that was going on, I had to learn how to deal with type 1 diabetes and how to manage it effectively. The third thing that pops into my mind, I guess, is challenging. New daily routines I had to establish, first with injections and then eventually, through pump management. And then learning how to count carbs and recognize highs and lows, how my body reacts to blood sugar trends based on exercise and stress and those types of things. And my goal at that time, and it still is today, is to leverage technology and make sure my habit patterns are effective so that I take diabetes management from the forefront to the background.
Have you had success with that? Do you feel like you've made the transition well?
I have. I believe in continuous improvement, so there's always more to do. I will say the technology, since I was diagnosed, specifically with pump management, it's just incredible. It takes less of me intervening, and it's really done by the pump itself and by the algorithms through the CGMs. And to me, again, that should be the goal for everybody, is to not have to focus so much on the daily aspects of type 1 diabetes management. We should let technology do that for us.
What else have you found valuable? I've spoken to thousands of people with type 1 diabetes. The one thing that took me by surprise, because I don't have type 1 myself and my daughter was very young when she was diagnosed, I didn't really understand until I launched this podcast, and then it grew into this kind of big Facebook presence. I heard people say, I don't know anybody else who has type 1 diabetes. I wish I knew more people. But until I saw them come together, I didn't recognize how important it was.
Yeah, I think similarly, I didn't know anyone with type 1 diabetes growing up as an adult, up until when I was diagnosed. And then all of a sudden, people just came out of the woodwork. And when CGMs first hit the market, certainly within the last 5 years, it's amazing to me and my family how many people we've noticed with type 1 diabetes, simply because you can see the CGM on their arm. I would say a month does not go by where we don't run into someone at a restaurant or an amusement park or a sporting event or somewhere where we see somebody else with type 1 diabetes. And the other surprising aspect of that is just how quickly you make friends. And I'll give an example. We were at a soccer tournament up in Raleigh this past Saturday and Sunday, and the referee came over to my son Charlie at the end of the game and said, "Hey, I noticed you were wearing a pump." And he lifted up his shirt and showed his pump as well and said, "I've had type 1 diabetes since I was 9 years old. I played soccer in college. I'm sure that's your aspiration. And I just want to tell you, don't let type 1 diabetes ever stop you from achieving your dreams of what you want to do." And this gentleman was probably in his late 50s or 60s. So just having that connection and seeing the outreach and people's willingness to share their experiences, it just means the world to us and just makes us feel like we're part of a strong community.
Yeah. So would you say that the most important things are strong technology, tools, understanding how to manage yourself, and a connection to others?
Yeah, technology for sure, and knowing how to leverage it. And then the community, and that community is your friends, your family, caregivers, for me, the Medtronic Champions community, all those resources that are out there to, help guide the way, but then help you keep abreast on, the new things that are coming down the pipe.
Yeah.
And to give you hope for eventually, that we can find a cure.
You mentioned that your son wanted to be a pilot. He also has type 1 diabetes. How old was he when he was diagnosed?
So Henry was diagnosed when he was 12 years old. It was just at the start of COVID. We were actually visiting my in-laws in Tennessee. We woke up in the morning and he had wet his bed. And several years before that, we had all 4 of our boys tested for TrialNet. So, predictor of whether or not they were going to develop type 1 diabetes. And Henry and one of his brothers tested positive for a lot of the indicators. So we always kind of had an inclination that there was a high degree of possibility he would develop it, but we always had it in the back of our mind as well. And so when that event happened at the beginning of COVID, we had him take his blood sugar on my glucometer, and it was over 400. And so right away, we knew that without even being diagnosed properly by an endocrinologist, that he was a type 1 diabetic. So we hurried home to get him properly diagnosed in Charlottesville. And then we just started the process, first grieving, but then acceptance and, his eventual becoming part of the team that nobody wants to join.
How old is he now?
Yeah, he's 15 years old now.
When's the first time he came to you and said, is this going to stop me from flying?
Almost immediately. So like me, he always had aspirations of flying. In fact, he, out of all 4 boys, wanted to be in the military. And that was a difficult part of the conversation, and maybe something that we don't talk about as a community. But there are some things you cannot do as a type 1 diabetic, and that's a hard fact of life. And unfortunately, joining the military is one of those hard and fast things. You cannot join the military as a type 1 diabetic. So that was very difficult for him and for me and my wife to get over. Then we also started talking about being a commercial pilot. And so I saw that same excitement in his eyes because, like me, he can be in an F-18 or a 737 or a Cirrus SR-20 that I fly and be just as happy. Yeah. So he still has that passion today and still very much plans to eventually become a commercial pilot.
I appreciate you sharing that with me. Thank you. You have 4 children. Do any others have type 1?
They do. My oldest twin, Henry, has type 1 diabetes, and my middle son, Charlie, has type 1 diabetes as well.
The boys are twins.
The oldest 2 are twins. One has type 1 diabetes. My middle son, who is not a twin, has type 1 diabetes.
I see. Is there any other autoimmune in your family?
There isn't. I'm really the only person in my family or my wife's family that we know of with any sort of autoimmune disease, certainly type 1 diabetes. So unfortunately, I was the first to strike it rich and unfortunately pass it along to 2 of my sons.
But celiac, thyroid, anything like that?
Nothing. We're really a pretty healthy family. So this came out of nowhere for myself and for my 2 sons.
That's really something. I appreciate your time very much, and I appreciate you sharing this with me. Thank you very much.
Anytime, Scott.
Learn more about the Medtronic Champion community at medtronicdiabetes.com/juicebox or by searching the hashtag Medtronic Champion on your favorite social media platform. If you're not already subscribed or following in your favorite audio app, please take the time now to do that. It really helps the show. And get those automatic downloads set up so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast. The episode you just heard was professionally edited by Wrong Way Recording. WrongWayRecording.com.